What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC Fight Night Diego Lopez versus Jean Silva, where I'll be discussing and breaking down each and every fight. Before we get started, let's quickly recap the lock of the week last week, where we had Mauricio Rufy losing our lock of the week streak. Absolutely heartbroken. Lock of the week ends with Mauricio Rufy. It was supposed to be 5 in a row. Now we're 4-1 in our last 5. Rufy gets dominated and submitted. BSD showed great wrestling, and Rufy showed some questionable fight IQ. I would have thought the fighting nerds were smart enough to execute a smart game plan, but Rufy really had no answer. There was some seriously questionable fight IQ though. After getting dominated in round 1, round 2 starts and Rufy lands some nice shots on the feet to start the round. Then BSD shoots for a takedown. Then Rufy kind of reverses it and ends up on top, but then decides to give up that dominant position in a round that he needed to win after losing the first round. Like, that made no sense. That happened 2 or 3 times where Rufy stood up rather than maintaining top control on the ground. He could have at least worked some ground and pound, but he stood up only to get taken down again, and it was just a disappointing performance. He got fraud checked. I let my emotions and excitement over Rufy get in the way. It got the better of me rather than seeing the fight for what it was, which was a tough stylistic matchup for striker. When you have a primarily striking based fighter against someone that just wants to smother you and disrupt your rhythm, that's going to be tough for the striker, right? But never again. We live and learn. Anyways, let's get started with the first fight of the night, where we have Quang Lee versus Santiago Luna. My pick for this fight is going to be Quang Lee. I believe that Santiago Luna is coming into this fight on short notice. I believe he's fighting on 2 weeks notice, which isn't the worst, but it's still not the best case scenario if you're making your debut at 21 years old versus someone who's as experienced as Quang Lee. Santiago Luna, his nickname is actually the Border Boy, and I don't know why. I started cracking up when I found out his nickname. I don't know why I found that so funny, but he's making his debut, the Border Boy, at 21 years old. He's fighting Quang Lee, who lost his first 2 UFC fights and now finally coming off of a win. In his debut, Quang Lee got outclassed by Chris Gutierrez. Then in his next fight, he gets into a back and forth war with Long Zhao, only to get knocked out in the 3rd round. Then finally, in his last fight, he gets a win over Gaston Bolanos, where he looked good in the striking, looked great in the wrestling. He took Gaston down multiple times, got his back, and choked him out. And after that fight, we saw him get emotional, and he was saying that this win meant everything for him. Coming off of 2 back-to-back losses, he understood how bad he needed that win. And for me, that's a really great sign, because it showed, yes, he lost his first 2 UFC fights, but he understood what's at stake in his 3rd fight. He knew he needed a win badly, and he made sure he got it. And I feel that just shows how motivated and driven he is and how locked in he was to make sure to get that win. He was able to wear down the striking of Bolanos using his wrestling and eventually choke him out. And overall, he's a decent technical striker with good power. His grappling we saw in his last fight has been improving and looking great. I feel he has some trouble when he comes up against anyone that's like fast twitch or just anyone with a speed advantage over him, because he isn't the quickest striker, but he is accurate and he holds power. And he's fighting Santiago Luna, who's making his debut, primarily a wrestler. He has 6 wins on his record, 4 of them coming by submission. He stays composed under pressure. He has great ground and pound, great wrestling. Only 21 years old, but of course, he hasn't fought anyone notable. And coming into his UFC debut on, I believe, only 2 weeks' notice against someone who has a decade more of experience and has a full training camp, who's had UFC experience, this isn't the best case scenario for him. I was actually watching Santiago Luna's last fight just to see what we're dealing with here. And Luna is definitely a grappler first, but it's nothing spectacular. In his last fight, he was in mount position on top of his opponent, and his opponent literally just got up. He was fully mounted, and the guy just got up. So Luna doesn't have this insane pressure wrestling. And in the same round, actually, he had then taken his opponent's back and then had him in a body triangle. Then the opponent still just got up. Like, there was nothing dominant about Luna's control, at least not in his last fight. But then when he got up, he ends up knocking out his opponent in a wild exchange. It kind of looked like a brawl, and his opponent has been knocked out many times before, so it wasn't anything too special. But the thing I'll say about Luna is that the gym he's training at has been home to some of other well-respected Mexican fighters in the UFC, like Brandon Moreno, Alexa Grasso, Michael Morales. But still, I think he's too young right now, and unexperienced coming up against someone with more experience than him by plus 10 years, who's had a full training camp, who's motivated, already tasted defeat and seems super determined to win. I see Luna coming into this matchup trying to get the takedowns. Maybe he might get one or two. I just don't see him holding down Quang Lee for too long. I don't think he'll be able to submit him or get any good ground and pound off on him. I could see Quang Lee defending those takedowns, managing the distance enough so that where he is landing the better strikes on the feet, using his technical striking to piece up Luna on the feet for the most part of this fight. Because Lee is a technical striker. He's improving wrestling as well. Plus, he has the UFC experience, and seems super motivated right now. Whereas Luna, he's only 21 years old on 2 weeks' notice. And it's not he's a wrestler first, but it's not like dominant wrestling in my opinion. He has shaky top control, so the pick has to be Quang Lee. I think he's gonna defend those shots and outstrike him at range and win the better minutes of this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we got Rodrigo Sezinando versus Daniil Donchenko. My pick for this fight is going to be Rodrigo Sezinando. Excuse me. All right, so we got two fighters here making their UFC debut, their official debut in the UFC, because this is the Ultimate Fighter finale, and it was supposed to take place a couple weeks ago actually, but Rodrigo got injured and now it's rescheduled to this weekend. We got Rodrigo Cesniando, who's an aggressive pressure fighter. He can push the pace, move forward. He has relentless pressure. His foundation, I'd say, is grappling and jiu-jitsu. He started jiu-jitsu at 14. But despite that, on the feet, this guy looks good. He looks fluid. He looks comfortable with his striking. He has heavy power in his shots. And I like this guy a lot based off of the fact that he takes his mentality seriously. He recognizes the mental aspect is crucial to winning. And when you have a fighter that says that, I know they're going to be a great fighter, because I truly believe a big part of being a great fighter is your mentality. Anyone can be fast, sharp, fluid, aggressive, or strong, but the thing that separates the good fighters from the great fighters is the mental aspect of the game, the mental space, and he recognizes that. He's also durable, and like I say, he pushes the pace in his fights. He's shown a bit of vulnerability in his only loss to someone who was able to withstand the pressure and take him to a decision. But other than that, this guy is a tank, finishing all four of his last four fights, three by knockout and one by submission. Who right now in this matchup, he's fighting Daniil Donchenko, and another aggressive fighter, mainly a striking based fighter. Uh, for Danielle. He comes from a kickboxing background. He was 18-2 in his kickboxing career, and his grappling has been coming together. He isn't afraid to engage. He likes to come forward, be aggressive, overwhelm opponents with strikes and get them in the clinch. And he also has some vulnerabilities to opponents that are durable, who were able to take him to a decision. The thing is, when you have a striker versus grappler, it's usually a matchup where whichever guy can implement their game plan will win the fight. But I don't think Rodrigo needs this fight on the ground so much, to the point where if it's not on the ground, he'll lose. His striking is definitely good enough to compete with Danielle. Uh, on top of that, he'll have the wrestling advantage as well. I think that Rodrigo's striking can be good enough to win the striking exchanges against the fighter who's primarily a striker, and can work his way into getting some takedowns as well, by using his striking. And I feel Daniel needs this fight on the ground. I mean, Daniel needs this fight on the feet for the most part, but even then, he's still in danger. While Rodrigo doesn't need this fight on the ground, he doesn't need the fight on the ground in order to have success. And he'll be good on the feet, and for sure he'll be good on the ground. So I think Rodrigo can get some good ground control, get him in the clinch, and even win some of the striking exchanges on the feet. So picking Rodrigo. And plus, he's a pressure grappler, with real power. He's durable, and he has that strong mentality. Coming up against an aggressive kickboxer like Daniil, who has decent clinch offense, I just think he's has defensive gaps when the longer the fight gets extended. I just think it would favor Rodrigo more, who's more well-rounded and more of a complete fighter. He's going to be mixing in striking into takedowns, and he's going to win more phases of this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we got Alice Pereira versus Montserrat Rendon. I'm picking Alice Pereira to win this fight. Alice Pereira, I actually thought she was Alex Pereira's sister, but then I found out that wasn't true. Alice Pereira, she's making her debut at 19 years old, the youngest female fighter in the UFC, which is really young to be in the UFC. But in her career, she's been looking good, finishing all her fights early in the first round, also coming off of her first decision victory, which is something you like to see considering she's been finishing all her fights uh, early in the fight. We don't have to wonder what she looks like when the fight goes past the first round. She was able to win a unanimous decision in a 5-round fight in her last fight. She's primarily a striker, looking impressive on the feet, but also has a submission win on her record, which is nice to see as well. She also has some aura about her. She has a fun style where she can snipe you, hit you with some nasty shots on the feet that drops opponents and knocks them out in a fun style, and she has a great personality as well. She knows how to bring attention to herself. I saw her wearing like a weird mask during one of her weigh-ins, and just her style of striking, it's exciting to watch. Like, she's a fun addition to the UFC for sure. She seems alive and excited to be in the UFC, and she's fighting Montserrat Rendon, 36 years old, which is a huge difference, 17-year age difference here. Montserrat, she's 1-1 in the UFC. She lost her last fight to Daria Zelenko, who's a decent fighter, but in her debut, Montserrat won a split decision victory to Tamiris Vidal. And if you are fighting Tamiris Vidal and you're having trouble, like barely scrapping by a win versus Tamiris Vidal, she's not someone that you should be having any trouble with, because Vidal is pretty much as close as you can get to a street fighter in the UFC. And yes, I would expect Montserrat to win that fight, to beat her, but beating Vidal by a split decision just shows the level that she's at. She lost to a decent fighter in her last fight, and I think she's fighting another decent fighter here, who's a dangerous fighter and in this fight, because I just think if you're barely scrapping by a win over Vidal, I think someone like Alice Pereira can handle you with ease, even though she's 19 years old and doesn't have that UFC experience. Alice is going to be aggressive in there, coming forward with shots while still being technical at the same time. She has real knockout power. She has relentless aggression, and she's demonstrated solid grappling, getting 4 takedowns in her last fight, winning the decision victory. And she's tall for the division, has a well-rounded game. And of course, we haven't seen her compete against high-level fighters, but we've seen Montserrat have trouble against Vidal. And for me, that just isn't good at all, coming up against someone who's been looking really good on the regional scene. We're going to see Montserrat come in, look for takedowns, because that's usually her main focus when she fights. Her striking is developing. But I think in the space that she has to close to cover the distance in order to get close to Alice will be the most dangerous moments for her, because that's when Alice will be able to tag her on the way in, and she's trying to close that distance. And I feel like we might see Montserrat start to panic wrestle when the striking isn't going her way. And I feel Alice has the conditioning to keep up with the pace of that type of fight. And I just think Alice will use her height and reach advantage to stay on the outside, use technical striking to pick her apart, manage distance so that Montserrat doesn't get too close, and tag Montserrat, who's been able to get tagged up in her fights before. I don't think Montserrat's grappling will be enough to win her this fight, because as she's trying to close the distance will be when she's getting tagged on the way in. And I feel enough damaging shots will land to the point where even if she does get taken down, or even if she does get a takedown, Alice would have won the round off of damage already, you know, and even then, I don't think Alice is going to be easy to hold down for a long period of time because we've seen Alice isn't just a striker or bust type of fighter, you know. So at 19 years old, I I'm going with Alice. You know, I think she's going to be tall and rangy, and she's an aggressive sniper. You know, and I feel she. Well, we know that she can wrestle if needed. You know, and at 36 years old, we've seen the ceiling of Montserrat. You know, she's a grinding wrestler. She has limited striking, and she had a close win to very low competition. So the pick has to be Alice. I think she's going to tag her on the way in, coming in. She keeps the range and lands the cleaner, more damaging shots. Moving on to our next fight, we got Alessandro Costa versus Alden Correa. I'm gonna pick Alden Correa to win this fight. You know, there's actually a lot of fighters making their debut on this card, and Alden Correa is one of them. You know, a well-rounded fighter, finishing 8 out of his 10 wins, 4 knockouts, 4 submissions, 2 decisions. So well-rounded for sure. You know, he's dangerous anywhere the fight goes. He has really nice technical striking, can take care of himself on the ground as well. You know, he can adapt to wrestling uh, whenever the fight presents wrestling. You know, he actually comes from Texas, so he'll have the crowd on his side here. And he's at a point in his career where I feel he's taken the losses he's needed to take and has grown from them. I feel he's matured as a fighter, having won his 4 last fights. You know, that no contest was a fight where he won by knockout in the first round, but it got overturned. I believe it's because he tested positive for some PEDs, but I'm not entirely sure on that. But yeah, he's well rounded, composed. We've seen him lose by decision against opponents who have shown resilience against him and were able to outwork him. But I think he's learned from those fights, and at 27, I think he's matured enough as a fighter to be ready for his UFC debut. And his striking has come a long way, you know, and I feel that's the way he'll be able to win this fight using his striking because he's fighting Alessandro Costa, who's 2-2 in the UFC. He lost to Amir Albazi by knockout and Steve Urseg by decision. So 2 guys in the top 15. He did beat Kevin Borjas uh, and Jimmy Flake, but those are 2 fighters I don't really put too much stock into, you know. So we know he loses to higher level competition, but he was able to beat 2 unranked opponents that weren't the most impressive victories, but he won them both by TKO. So when it comes to their styles, they're both well rounded. You know, Costa has finished 11 out of his 14 wins, 5 knockouts, 6 submissions, just like Alden Correa, finishing 8 out of his 10 wins, 4 knockouts, 4 submissions. And this fight probably won't go the distance considering how much finishes they both have. But Costa, you know, he has decent grappling, he has relentless ground and pound, and he's a dangerous striker. He has power in his shots, but he does get hit often. And he doesn't have the best striking defense, but he's still dangerous and has the ability to get you out of there if he lands the right shots, like he's shown versus Jimmy Flake and Kevin Borjas. Excuse me. Um, Costa also has UFC experience on uh, in this matchup. You know, I see Alden Correa coming and instantly trying to get Costa on the back foot. Alden Correa coming forward and instantly trying to get Costa on the back foot and put up some high volume on the feet. But I think Costa is going to fight back enough so that it's competitive. But I do think Alden's striking will be better here. I believe Costa is also coming into this fight off of a knee injury as well. So we'll see how he looks in this matchup. You know, I can see this fight taking place mostly on the feet. And I feel like it really is kind of a toss-up in this matchup. You know, none of these guys have shown anything extraordinary in their career. You know, I feel they're both pretty much as average as it gets. Like they can both fight just enough to compete well with each other. I don't think anyone has the edge in this fight, and it would be the logical thing to do to side with the guy who actually has the UFC experience when it comes to this fight, to a fight like this. And not only that, I feel like Costa might have the better fight IQ. Uh, you know, in his last fight, when he was fighting Kevin Borjas, He landed a nice leg kick that wobbled Borjas, and Costa recognized that and continued to hit those leg kicks until Borjas went down and couldn't walk anymore. But I'm gonna go with Alden Coria to win this fight because despite Costa having the UFC experience, has shown good fight IQ in his last fight. I just think Alden Corea's striking is just a tad bit better, a tad bit more technical, a tad bit more fluid, and I like the way he moves in and out. I feel like he will land the more accurate shots in the feet, and I feel like his footwork is going to help him out a lot in this matchup. So in a fight that I think will be taking place mostly on the feet, I think Alden Correa he might just have the better striking in this matchup to win him his UFC debut in his hometown. So although Costa is UFC tested, he's a dangerous ground and pound finisher, but I think he's hittable. And coming up against Alden Correa, who's making his debut, I think Correa is well rounded. He has clean footwork. I just think his boxing is a bit sharper. So I think he edges the stand up on accuracy and volume. In a matchup that's kind of a toss up, I'm going to side with Alden Correa. Next up on the card, we got Zachary Reese versus Sedriques Dumas. I'm going to say Sedriques Dumas wins this fight. Zachary Reese, his wins in the UFC are to literal lowest level of competition the UFC has to offer. He beat Duško Todorovic, Jose Medina, and Julian Marquez. Those are his 3 wins. Probably the least impressive 3 victories you can have in the UFC. And that's not even a joke, And in his 2 losses, he lost to Cody Brundage and Asmat Bekoyev, I believe is his name. Anytime he faces someone who's actually dangerous, he pretty much just lays on his back and tries to do damage while laying on the ground. And that always seems to cost him. He's been knocked out in 2 of his losses, laying on his back, fighting 2 opponents that actually have knockout ability. And in his last fight versus Duško, I just thought it was really unimpressive. There was no real intent to actually finish the fight. He was content with having a sparring match. And I was thinking while watching, like, I can't believe these 2 guys actually had a fight camp. And this is the way they performed. They look like they just got off the couch after having back surgery or something. It looked like they both gassed out. And it was just pretty much a boring fight, in my opinion. And against Duško Todorovic, like, come on, you got to have a better performance against Duško at least, But his gas tank and his chin are definitely his weaknesses. Because if you're gassed out fighting Duško, I just feel you have 0 chance being a real contender in the UFC. In the first round, he can be dangerous when he still has his energy, but because if he lands a nice shot, but if it goes past the first round, I feel like he's just going to be in trouble. And he's fighting Sedriques Dumas, who's won 3 decision victories in the UFC already. But he's also has been a bit chinny as well. So I feel like the first round has potential to be fireworks, considering they both are susceptible to getting knocked out early. But after that, as the fight goes on, I can see Sedriques looking like a much better fighter. Excuse me, in rounds 2 and 3. And he's coming off of a loss where he was a bit too aggressive coming in and got caught. And I think he's going to learn from that. He's not going to rush in too recklessly and might have success on as the fight goes on. And plus, he's never lost 2 fights in a row. Do what you want with that information. And I think he has what it takes to beat Zachary Reese. Because Zach's wins in the UFC, just literally the 3 most unimpressive victories you can have. Lost to Cody Brundage as well, who Sedriques actually beat, and Sedriques is athletic, he's well-rounded, and I think he's at a much higher level than anyone that Zachary has beaten, and I think as the fight goes on, we'll see Sedriques utilize some leg kicks to deal with the height and reach of Zach. I think he'll outpoint him as the fight goes on, remain composed during the first round, not get into a firefight. Maybe even get Zach in the clinch and work in there as well. I think Sedriques is going to be more cautious in the first round because we know that's when Zach is the most dangerous in the first round. But even if he gets into a firefight, I feel like Zach is just a bit more chinny than Sedriques, and I think Sedriques might actually be more durable. So as the fight goes on, we'll see Sedriques have more output, more activity. I think he survives the first round and takes over in the later rounds. So Zachary Reese, he is a fast starter, but I think he fades as the fight goes on, and he has very questionable cardio and very chinny as well. Where I see Dumas being more athletic, more composed, and I think he's going to use his leg kicks a lot in this fight. He's going to use the clinch in this fight, and he's coming off of a knockout loss, so I don't think he's going to be rushing in like he did in his last fight. So I think Sedriques is going to be able to survive the first round and outworks him in rounds 2 and 3. Moving on to our next fight, we got Jesus Aguilar versus Luis Gurule. I'm gonna go Jesus Aguilar to win this fight. So since 2015, the only two losses Jesus Aguilar has is to Rafael Estevan and Tatsuro Taira. Absolute killers in this division, high level guys. Besides those two losses, those two absolute beasts that he lost to, he's beating guys up. On the other hand, you have Luis Gurule, who got instantly fraud checked, lost his undefeated record as soon as he came into the UFC, and it was to Ode Osborne, someone who isn't really at the highest level. He's just Aguilar is actually really good. If you look at the fight he had versus Shannon Ross, he got that 17-second knockout. You'd be a fan of his. It was a picture perfect knockout, absolutely flatlined him. His main focus is his grappling. He has 7 submission wins on his record. Usually using his striking to set up his takedowns. He can push the pace, snatch up a submission any chance he gets. But the thing is, he's very small and has a short reach on top of that. And he's susceptible to being taken down himself. On the other hand, you have Luis Gurule, who will be bigger in this matchup. He's also pretty well-rounded, but he as well is primarily a wrestler. His striking is developing. He's more of a high volume pressure type of striker, not someone who really holds that one shot knockout power. But it is the flyweight division, so that's pretty rare. We've seen Lewis get a win in the we've seen Lewis get a we haven't seen Lewis get a win in the UFC. He got smoked in his debut, whereas we've seen Jesus Aguilar get 3 wins in the UFC, and Jesus losses in the UFC have been to really elite competition. So we know he's above average, and that's not something we can say we know about Lewis. I feel like Jesus is more of a dog and can probably outpace him in this matchup. I think Jesus is going to be constantly looking for takedowns in this fight, trying to take down Lewis throughout the fight. Might be successful, he might not, but at the very least, I think he can push him up against the fence and win minutes that way if he has to. He can just grind on Lewis against the fence as he's trying to drag him down onto the ground. And I think this fight will be a battle of who can get control over one another. I think Jesus will be able to outdog Lewis in the wrestling by having more dangerous striking game, which will allow him to work in his wrestling, because we know that Jesus has some serious knockout power. And after coming off of a loss, Lewis is going to be cautious, not wanting to get hit like that again. So I think Jesus will use that power threat in a way that will help him get the takedowns and maybe even find a submission on the ground. So I'm gonna go with Jesus. He's a submission specialist with knockout threat. He's proven versus better competition. Whereas you have Lewis, who will be bigger in this matchup. He's a pressure wrestler and volume striker, but I just think he's unproven in the UFC right now. So I just think the threat of power is going to be able to allow Jesus to get some takedowns. I think he's going to be able to control him or even submit him in this matchup. Moving on to our next fight, we got Tatiana Suarez versus Amanda Lemos. We gotta go Tatiana Suarez here. I'm going Tatiana Suarez. She has to win this fight. Gets into the UFC, gets 7 wins in a row, dominates the whole roster, fights Weili Zhang, one of the greatest female fighters of all time, then gets her first loss to Weili. Now she's fighting a 38-year-old aging Amanda Lemos, who's never really been considered elite uh, for in this division. Not at the highest level. I think Tatiana Suarez is pretty much a lock in this matchup. She has dominant wrestling, elite jiu-jitsu, really accurate strikes when she does strike. Someone when she's striking someone that's not Wei Li Zhang, and she's able to put up a high pace and pressure opponents, and she overwhelms opponents with control time, and she's super strong as well. She's fighting Amanda Lemos, who's a decent fighter, primarily a powerful striker, but overall as a fighter, not on the same level I would say as Tatiana Suarez. Amanda, she has good striking, good accuracy with solid power, has some nice body kicks, calf kicks. Her wrestling is improving, but she gets hit often. She actually absorbs more strikes then she lands. And on top of that, her grappling defense isn't too good as well. She suffered two submission losses. And when you're getting hit more than you land, you're open to being submitted. Someone like Tatiana Suarez has everything she needs to dominate this matchup. I can see Tatiana landing takedowns consistently if she has to. She averages more than 4 takedowns per fight. And I think she'll be able to find the submission. And on the feet, I think Tatiana can avoid any dangerous striking exchanges coming from Lemos, close the distance on her, and gather up some control time on her. Lemos is going to try to find that powerful knockout shot on the feet, but I think Tatiana is too high level for that. And too much more athletic, younger, sharper than Lemos, to the point where that would just be too predictable for Tatiana. I think she's going to see those shots coming. Lemos has to try to create space between her and Suarez, using her footwork to keep the fight standing and try to land some nice shots on the feet and not get taken down. But even then, Tatiana's striking is good enough to create some takedown entries for her. Get Lemos down on the ground. Tatiana is definitely the superior grappler and submission artist. So you got to go with her elite wrestling and BJJ. I think she's gonna put up a solid pace and get those takedowns. Averaging 4 takedowns per fight against a dangerous, powerful striker. But Amanda Lemos, she has poor grappling defense, so I just think Tatiana Suarez, she's going to be repeatedly getting those takedowns and gather up the control time. Most likely submit her in this matchup as well. So moving on to our next fight, we got Claudio Puelles versus Joaquim Silva. I'm gonna go Claudio Puelles to win this fight. So Claudio Puelles, he loses his UFC debut in 2016 by TKO against a very low level fighter, but then puts up together a nice 5-fight win streak in the UFC against some journeymen, right? But now most recently losing back-to-back against Dan Hooker and Faris Ziam, who are both the highest level of competition he's faced. But fighting against Joaquim Silva, this isn't anyone considered to be high level at all. I mean, he almost has more losses than he has wins in the UFC. He's been super inconsistent, losing to a low-level competition. He has never really found his rhythm in the UFC and doesn't seem like he can put up a win streak together. And at 36 years old, I feel he hasn't shown any improvements at this point yet. He won't. I don't think he's going to magically show up this fight with anything different. I mean, we've seen this guy fight time and time again, and it's the same inconsistent fighter we've always seen. Whereas with Claudio, he actually seems like he has time and space to improve. Losing back to back against decent level competition, I feel this should be easy work for Claudio, right? And Claudio, he has decent grappling, high level jiu-jitsu. His striking is coming along, strong top control. He averages more than 3 takedowns per 15 minutes. He stays composed, but he does get hit at times and has shown vulnerabilities to powerful strikers like Dan Hooker and the guy he lost to in his debut. But in his most recent fight with Faris Ziam, it was pretty competitive. He lost by a split decision. Faris Ziam, I'd say, is a high-level fighter. And Claudio was able to land multiple takedowns in that fight, which was impressive. And against someone at the level of Joaquim Silva, I feel Claudio will be able to do the same, hold top control. And if he can't hold him down, I feel he'll still be able to continue to take him down time and time again if he can't have that top pressure control on him. I think if Silva does get up, he can get taken down again and again. So, Joaquim Silva, he does have decent striking, but he hasn't really beat anyone impressive enough, or he hasn't had a performance impressive enough for me to say, yeah, he can beat someone like Claudio. So, Silva is getting up there in age, right? And I don't think he's going to show anything new in this fight. He's been too inconsistent. I think Claudio can stay out of danger and outclass him throughout the fight. I see Claudio getting the takedowns, wearing down and frustrating Joaquim Silva, while Silva tries to land powerful shots. I just don't think that they'll land on a fighter like Claudio, whose level is just a step above uh that step above that anyone Silva has beaten, right? So Puelles, Claudio Puelles, he has strong jiu-jitsu, he has strong top control. He's improving on his entries and his takedowns, and I think he has good composure. Where Silva, he's been inconsistent and he's hittable. He does have decent power and technique, but I think he's aging, and I think the youth and athleticism might favor Claudio in this matchup. So I think Claudio's going to be able to drag him down repeatedly and banks on control time to win this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we have, excuse me, we got Jose Medina versus Duško Todorovic. I'm going to go Duško Todorovic to win this fight, but I'm not kidding when I say this. I genuinely think these two guys are actually the worst two fighters in this whole division. This is such a filler fight, like needing an extra fight to be on the card that means absolutely nothing. This is one of those fights, none of these guys really belong in the UFC. Most definitely don't belong anywhere near the rankings of this division. It's as low as a level as it gets in the UFC. You have Jose Medina, who's slow, sloppy, 0-3 in the UFC. I'm not sure how he ever got a win in his career. Duško Todorovic, on the other hand, 3-6 in the UFC, and his wins mean absolutely nothing. He's stiff, slow, unathletic. I think you got to get both of them out of here. I feel like Jose Medina, he's more of a dog. He's very tough. He can get his ass beat and still come forward, but that's if he isn't knocked out. And I don't see Duško knocking him out. These guys, they pretty much have pillow hands, right? Jose's gonna come in aggressively, try to land power shots, eat some shots, come forward. But I can see Duško dealing with that by pushing him up against the fence, working in some takedowns, or trying to. Also, I think Duško, he's more versatile in his strikes. Duško will throw more calf kicks, more body kicks, more head kicks, and just has more tools. Whereas Jose just likes to come forward, eat shots, and try to land on you. I think Duško will be the more technical and smarter fighter here, but Jose just might outdog him here. I'm going to assume Duško is more smarter and uses his wrestling in this matchup. He's going to land the more effective strikes from range and just be the more technical fighter, while Jose tries to look for a brawl, and I don't think he gets one in this matchup, because he's tough. He'll pressure forward, but I think he has limited tools, and he also is really hittable. Where Todorovic, he has a variety of kicks. He's better in the clinch and wrestling positions, and he has those options in his back pocket as well. But he also is a bit fragile at times. But I'm gonna say that Duško uses more kicks, gets more control in the clinch, and wins a smarter fight than Jose Medina. Moving on to our next matchup, we got Kelvin Gastelum versus Dustin Stoltzfus. I'm going to go Kelvin Gastelum. I'm going to go Kelvin Gastelum to win this fight. But when you look at Kelvin Gastelum's career, he really doesn't have any notable wins. I guess Chris Curtis was a decent win, but Chris Curtis isn't at the highest level. Gastelum, he knocked out Michael Bisping, but that was an old Bisping with one eye. Gastelum pretty much always loses to high-level competition, like Adesanya, Whitaker, Sean Brady, even lost to Darren Till, Jared Cannonier, Jack Hermanson. He even has losses to Neil Magny and Tyron Woodley, but that was like a decade ago. And most recently, he lost to Joe Pyfer. But in his most recent fight to Joe Pyfer, I mean, he proved once again, he has a chin on him. This guy is durable, never been knocked out, and even came back in the third round. It looked like he was landing some decent shots on Piper. He's never been knocked out his whole career. The guy has a block head, he has a cinder block head. But when it comes to high level competition, he gets outclassed. He has decent striking, decent wrestling, but he hasn't wrestled in any of his fights recently. And of course, durable as a brick. And luckily for him, in this fight, he isn't fighting anyone at the top of the division. He's fighting Dustin Stoltzfus, who's got good striking, who's got good grappling. He can put up a good pace, but I definitely wouldn't say he's as durable as Kevin. They're both inconsistent in putting up great performances, but Kevin has fought the much better competition and has been in there with, getting experience with the best of the best the division has to offer. In his last fight with Nursidin Rozoboyev, Dustin was grapple heavy coming into that fight, focusing mostly on getting takedowns, but ultimately lost because Rozoboyev was able to escape and land some damaging shots. But if Dustin comes into this matchup with Kevin looking for takedowns, I don't think he's going to have much success in doing so. Kevin is going to be shorter than Dustin in this fight, and Dustin's going to have a hard time getting in on the hips of the shorter fighter. Kevin's going to be able to stuff those takedowns and will be able to dictate where this fight takes place. And I think Kevin's going to find success in finding the right shots to land on Dustin, using his boxing and his pressure. Even if Dustin comes at him aggressively, Kevin is durable, to take those shots and keep coming, land his own power shots. And yeah, I just think Kevin's going to find success in finding the right shots to land on Dustin, using his boxing, his pressure. And yeah, like I said, if Dustin does come at him aggressively, Kevin's durable enough to take those shots and keep coming, landing his own power shots, and using his wrestling to keep this fight wherever he feels most comfortable. He can pretty much dictate if he wants his fight on the ground or on the feet. And I think Dustin's going to have a hard time taking down Kevin and or even hurting Kevin on the feet. I can see this fight being pushed to a frantic pace. Both fighters going after it. I think it's going to be up to whoever can keep up the pace, but that will ultimately win the final round to win the fight. But I'm gonna say that Kevin's durable enough to withstand any danger from Dustin. I think he has the sharper boxing in this matchup, and he has really good takedown defense in my opinion. Against someone at the level of Dustin, and not to mention the huge experience edge that he has in this matchup. So I think Stoltzfus is going to try to wrestle. I think he's going to have inconsistent success here, and overall in his career, he's had inconsistent success, and he's also less durable, right? So I'm gonna say Kelvin keeps it standing and wins through pace and the boxing exchanges in this matchup, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Rafa Garcia versus Jared Gordon. I'm gonna say Rafa Garcia wins this fight. I'm gonna say Rafa Garcia wins this fight. So Jared Gordon is actually coming off of a dominant win over Thiago Moises, which was probably the most impressive victory he's had his whole career. But other than that, nothing else really stands out for Jared Gordon. He's 37 years old right now, fighting Rafa Garcia, who's 31 years old, who might have a significant athleticism advantage over him. But Rafa himself hasn't had any impressive wins on his record neither, right? So in this fight, Jared, he's going to be coming forward, trying to land some nice boxing combinations, put up some heavy pressure and volume. He's also shown to have decent grappling as well if the fight hits the mat, but I think he'll try to keep this fight standing for the most part. But even then, he's vulnerable to big power shots, not the most durable, and also hasn't been too consistent in the UFC, right? So just like Rafa though, uh, Rafa hasn't been consistent, and I think he's going to try to get this fight on the mat. He's grapple heavy. His striking is evolving, puts up a good pace with a high work rate. I think Rafa is going to have a grappling advantage here, and he'll be looking to grind on grind on Jared Gordon, wear him down throughout the fight. He might have to weather a storm trying to close the distance, but once he gets a hold of Jared, I think he can get him down. While Jared might land some shots on the feet, I think once he gets taken down, Rafa will be able to hold him down and win some minutes on the ground. At the very least, I think Rafa can grind on Jared against the fence, push him up against the cage, lay on him in that way. If he has to, then try to drag him down and win minutes through gathering control time. So yeah, Garcia, he's a grapple grind heavy wrestler. He has a high work rate, and I think he can win this fight through just cage control, gathering up minutes on the ground with control, Where Jordan, he does have the pressure boxing and volume, but I think he can be vulnerable to takedowns and being controlled on the mat. So I'm gonna go Rafa Garcia. I think the clinch and takedown is going to disrupt Gordon's rhythm, and I think he's going to win the rounds based off of ground control time. Gathering up that ground control time. Moving on to our next fight, we got Alexander Hernandez versus Diego Pereira. I'm gonna go Alexander Hernandez, right? I mean, we gotta go Alexander Hernandez here. I mean, he's coming off of a sick performance victory over Chase Hooper. Like, what was it, 2 weeks ago? It feels like, where he looked really slick, moving in and out, landing nice, powerful shots, drops Hooper in the first round. The guy looked fresh. The only problem he was dealing with were probably those leg kicks, those step in leg kicks to the knee, those oblique kicks that Hooper was throwing. But other than that, nothing really phased him in his last fight. Chase Hooper, his punches did no damage at all. Hernandez had no respect for Hooper's power, was fast. Hernandez was fast, sharp, and accurate, landing a nice, powerful bomb that dropped Hooper. And I feel that's always been his style, that in and out style. Uh, he's sharp, he's measured, and he just tries to outwork you. But we've seen Hernandez get taken down, which is probably why he was an underdog in that fight. But he was able to keep it standing and did what he had to do, move in and out, land the big shot to put him down. When it comes to high level competition, Alexander Hernandez has shown to be inconsistent. We've seen him get held down, we've seen him get knocked out. But he still holds decent power in his shots. He's aggressive and puts up a good pace. And against Diego Ferreira, I think he can find success on the feet using that in and out style like he did in his last fight. I think Hernandez's striking will be superior in this matchup, even though Diego's striking is evolving. Still, I think Diego's strongest asset will be his grappling, but I really like what we saw from Alexander Hernandez in his last fight. He was able to keep the fight on the feet and land the better shots. The difference here is, though, that Diego is going to have much more power than Chase Hooper did, right? But Diego does get hit as well. So I think Hernandez is just going to be a bit more sharper and accurate and have more effect with his shots, more impact in his shots. So I think Hernandez will be able to maintain range on Diego, strike him when he feels like it, move in and out like he usually does, dictates the pace, and give Diego a hell of a storm to deal with, And I think Diego's best way to win here would probably be to look for the takedowns, but I think Hernandez is just too locked in right now. He'll be able to keep it on the feet, strike, and land the better shots. And on top of that, Diego is 40 years old. His gas tank in the later rounds could be a big issue in this fight. So I'm going to say that the speed of Hernandez, that in and out power boxing style, along with momentum, is going to allow him to have the better tools, at range in the striking. And versus Diego Ferreira, who's a crafty vet, he's decent. He's a decent grappler, decent boxer. I just think he's 40 years old. He's too hittable. I think the movement and speed for Alexander Hernandez is going to play a big part here, and he's going to win those striking exchanges. So moving on to our next fight, we got David Martinez versus Rob Font. I'm going David Martinez. I'm a huge fan of David Martinez. A huge fan of his striking. Yes, Rob Font is good. He's only lost to elite competition. He just shut down he just shut down the hype of Gene Matsumoto in a very close fight where I thought he actually lost that fight. I don't think he won that fight. So it wasn't really shutting down any hype or momentum. And Rob Font, he shut down the Kyler Phillips hype, right? And for whatever hype Kyler Phillips had. And now taking on another prospect who's 27 years old. Not to mention also, he Rob Font lost to Davison Figueiredo not too long ago, and that's not really a big win, or like an excusable loss to have on your record. Davison Figueiredo, he's also coming up there on age and hasn't looked too impressive, but now he's fighting 27-year-old David Martinez. And I think David Martinez is the truth. And at 38 years old, yeah, Rob, he still looks good. He moves well. He's athletic, right? I just think in this fight that will mostly take place in the stand up, Martinez is just so powerful, so dangerous and accurate with his shots. The way he uses his footwork, and don't get me wrong, Rob Font has some good footwork as well, but the power difference here, I think is going to be very evident. I mean, out of his 12 wins, 10 have come by knockout for David Martinez. And I think obviously it's a completely different competition, but there for sure will be a power difference here. And once David Martinez lands, it's going to be accurate. He's going to have impact on his shots. The kid is just athletic and moves in and out really nicely. He's had only one fight in the UFC, so we can't really start hyping him up. But he looked really good in his debut. Showed his power, his accuracy, his finishing ability. And I'm not saying he's going to finish Rob Font, but there's a chance. Maybe he will. But I know he's going to land accurately and with power throughout the fight. And he's really fast. He has a kickboxing background, puts up good volume on the feet. Rob will be coming forward as well, putting up good volume of his own. He has nice, powerful, sharp jab. He can keep up a good pace, decent boxing skills, but I think David would be able to dictate the pace of this fight using his distance control, and he'll be able to disrupt the rhythm of Rob Font's boxing, and David will engage on his terms, moving in and out. When David lands, he'll have the more power in his shots and accuracy behind those shots. And even though Rob Font has never been knocked out, I still think David can put up some nice volume and damage in this fight. I think in this striking matchup, David will be the one who has more speed, more power, more athleticism, and I think David will be landing while Rob will be relying on his durability a bit too much in this matchup. And of course, Rob has that experience advantage over him. The level of competition doesn't even compare, but stylistically, I'm a fan of David's striking. I think it's going to work out well in this matchup, because, yeah, Rob Font, he does have the experience. He has that nice jab. He puts up good volume. He has smart footwork. But I just think Martinez is a better version of him. He's explosive. He has accurate power. He's athletic. And he has really good distance management as well. I think that's going to play a big part in here, too. The way that David Martinez moves in and out. I think he's going to be landing the heavier, cleaner shots in a fight that's mostly going to take place on the feet. I just think David Martinez will be the better striker in this matchup. Moving on to our next fight, we got the main event of the evening, Jean Silva versus Diego Lopez. I'm going to go Jean Silva. So out of all the fighting nerds, I think Jean Silva might be the best one. I've always thought that Jean Silva is the best fighting nerd. I'm not just saying that because Rufi and Kyle just lost this weekend. I think he's more game than any of them. It's either him or Carlos Prates, but Gene is really good. A great striker who's shown that he can keep this fight standing if the opponent tries to go for takedowns. He has the build to be a great fighter. He's built like a tank who he likes to keep the fight standing. He's short, built like a tank, and it's hard to get in on his hips. And if you do get in on his hips, you have to deal with his strength of him pushing himself off of you, right? So not only can he keep this fight standing, he's dangerous. Every shot he throws is being thrown with intent to hurt you. Like, his shots sting, and it's like a heavy boxing style. He uses his jab to bait you in. Counters really nicely, and has exceptional finishing ability, right? So I just think, yeah, like I said, he also has great takedown defense, and at 86%, takedown defense. He's strong enough to keep the fight where he wants it, and he has a dynamic. He has dynamic strikes with some serious power behind those shots. Plus he's so confident in there. Like he's just always having fun. Playing games, talking to the crowd. Seems very calm in there. Fights to his own rhythm. And in this matchup with Diego Lopez, it's going to be. I think it's going to mostly be a stand-up battle. I mean, in his last fight with Volkanovski, Diego didn't shoot for a single takedown, right? He was pretty much chasing Volk the whole fight, the whole 5 rounds, looking for a big knockout shot. I think Volkanovski's footwork was really hard to deal with, and if this matchup with Jean Silva is going to be a striking battle, I don't think Diego Lopez is going to have much success here. With Jean Silva, especially if Diego Lopez fights the same way that he fought in his last fight, looking for the big knockout shot. Because Jean Silva fights to his own pace. He has really great footwork. He doesn't get lured into a brawl. He's smart. He uses his footwork nicely, and he lures you in, then strikes you with some clean counter punches. But the thing is, Diego isn't bad on the ground. If he were to come into this fight focused heavily on the grappling, excuse me, uh, he would probably have more success than trying to strike with Gene, because Lopez has some high level jiu-jitsu. I just don't think that's the style that he's going to come into this matchup with. But if this fight does hit the ground, I can see Diego going for many submissions, and he's a dangerous submission artist. But typically Diego is an aggressive starter, using his boxing, comes forward with a fast pace and tries to get you out of there. And he has good power behind his shots too, but against Jean Silva, who's hard to hit, hard to reach, hard to touch at the very least, even if you do land on Jean Silva, he's never been finished by strikes or submission. And I don't see him putting Jean Silva away in the first round, as especially not in the first round, because that's typically what Diego Lopez likes to do. He likes to get you out of there early. But as the fight goes on, I think Silva is going to get more into his flow, find his rhythm and land the better shots. And I think his footwork is going to help him out a lot in this fight when it comes to someone like Diego Lopez, whose foot is always on the gas pedal. He's trying to walk you down and find the right shot. I just don't think that's the correct style to beat someone as fluid in movement as Jean Silva. I can see Jean Silva moving around, counter striking, landing the better shots. I mean, he's built like a tank. It'll be hard to hold him down if he does get taken down or get put in a clinch position. It'll be hard to control him because he's super strong and built like a tank, like I said. Although I don't think Diego Lopez will try to do that. Especially if Jean Silva is moving around the octagon. And he has Diego Lopez chasing him around, and not only that, it's going to be hard for Jean Silva to get a hold of him. I think he's going to be chasing him around, and yeah, not only that, like mentally as well. And Silva plays these mental games in the octagon, and even before the fight, I feel like he's such a troll and will try to get under Diego's skin to frustrate him somehow. Be playing mind games in the octagon, outside the octagon, and it's obvious that Diego Lopez is a fast starter. He's going to come out looking for a big knockout shot, but I don't think that'll work with someone as high level as Jean Silva is in the striking, right? And there's a chance that Lopez can land a big counterpunch, because sometimes Silva likes to come in and swing wild hooks. But from what we've seen, I think Silva is durable enough to take a shot and stick to the game plan, using his footwork and landing the better shots. So yeah, I just think Silva, he's compact. He's built like a tank. He has slick counters. He also has 86% takedown defense, and he just has nasty finishing instincts. Whereas Lopez is an aggressive starter. He has elite Brazilian jiu-jitsu. His striking is dangerous, but it's more of like a hunting aggressively type of style, where like Jean Silva is going to be more on the technical side of the fight. And I feel the footwork and counters from Jean is going to just frustrate Diego Lopez throughout the fight, and it's going to keep it standing in order to win this fight. So yeah, you got to go Jean Silva in this matchup. And that does conclude, I believe. Yeah, that does conclude the picks for this week's UFC fight card. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you're rolling with. Drop your predictions down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks, or if you thought they were absolutely horrible. I'd love to hear what you all thought. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day. I love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.